Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Business of Biochar Symposium. I'm just going to share my screen here, and we'll just go through a quick run through of the how to use the platform for anyone who's new joining us today. So just as a reminder, you were in networking mode before. You just double click to move from table to table. Now we're in presentation mode, and you will be able to see the screen. In order to participate, you'll see on the right-hand side our chat, participants, and Q&A features. So chat is where you'll have your communication. Remember, please keep the general chat to biochar topics. If you have technical difficulties, please use the private chat feature, which is, remember, you click the left button out of general chat, and then it will show you all the other types of chat. So you'll search for my name, Caroline P, if you have technical difficulties, and send me a message, and we'll work it out there. Participants will show you who's on actively right now, and Q&A is where you'll ask your questions. Reminder that if you see a question you like, upvote it, and then our moderators throughout the event will be starting with the top generally and working their way down. As you upvote questions, it moves to the top. So that's how to get the questions you want to see answered first. I want to give a big thank you to our sponsors. We have our gold sponsor, Walk Foundation, our silver sponsors, Vow and Pyreg. And just as a reminder, they do have tables to speak to representatives from any of our sponsors. And that also includes our partnering organizations, IBI and IBUSBI. To speak to any of their representatives, you're going to want to find them on floor 1 at their booths. The floors do technically each show their booths and their media. Remember to click on their media, but floor 1 is where you're going to want to find them. And then we also have our bronze sponsors, Restoration Fuels, Glanris, Clean Air, Safe Forest, which is the Devonshire group, Metzler Forest Products, Quantum Loophole, Bioforce Tech Corporation, Long Island Energy, Biomass Controls, and TerraChar. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors for your support of the event. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. And then just a quick schedule of the day. So we're having a very similar schedule to the one that we had yesterday. We're going to be starting with our first session, Financing Biochar Opportunities. Then we'll be taking our networking break. We're going to have a 20-minute networking break today. Then we're going to come back for another session on biochar startups perspectives on investor prospecting. And then we're going to do a series of videos, this time on our CharTech. So it's going to be a lot like Shark Tank. And then we're going to come back and we're going to have our last session, which is the future of biochar, to wrap up our event today. And just as a reminder, we always have an hour of networking right after the event. So stick around for that. Kathleen Draper is up on screen now. She is our organizer of the event for our content, and she is also our moderator for our first session. So Kathleen, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. Oh, it's gone. Yeah, so today we wanted to focus on investments because both Tom and I are seeing an incredible increase in interest from investors, venture capitalists, and other types of funders in the biochar space. So the idea was that we would give you both the perspective of those interested in investing in different biochar companies, but we also wanted to give you the perspective of biochar companies that have been courting investors successfully. So that will be panel 2. But this morning we're joined with 4 different people that are investors, or in the case of Teresa from South Pole, they are considering different types of non-equity investments in the biochar space. So the first panelist we'll hear from is Hans-Jörg Lerchmiller. He has been both an investor and an investee. He's been courting additional investors for one of the companies he's invested in. He's also the chairman of the board for the European Biochar Industry Consortium, and he is an all-around team player and a significant asset to the biochar industry. So Hans-Jörg, if you want to come on stage.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen, and real pleasure to be here in that session. So let me right away jump into the presentation, which I'm going to share my screen, the window, and here we go. Yeah, I mean, the topic of today's talk is why biochar is a great place to be as an investor, and I'd like to give a few thoughts on this question. Now, first, a bit more on my background. So I would say I'm an environmental entrepreneur. I founded various companies. I invested in many companies, typically in a very, very early stage, sometimes even PowerPoint stage. In my previous life, I had been a founder and the CEO of a solar energy company. I founded that company in 2005. And in a way, I would say the biochar environment is more or less in the stage where solar was in the year 2000, maybe, or even a bit earlier. And what I'm focusing on commercializing new technologies. So I was really lucky that in 2017, I was approached by a company called Carbuna to invest, and I became an investor, and over the years, kind of the strong investor in the company. Carbuna is a leading producer of biochar-based products in agriculture. Then in 2018, I took an active decision to focus the second half of my life, my professional life, on biochar. I mean, the first half was on solar, but I will further outline a little bit on this point how that came. Then in 2019, there was also a learning from the solar industry. I initiated, together with a couple of other people like Helmut Gerber from Pyrec, Marcel Huber, and a few others from Synkraft, and a few others, we initiated the European Biochar Industry Consortium in order to build an ecosystem. And then in 2020, I became co-founder and investor in Carbon Future, which I will talk a little bit about. And then I think that a very important element to my biochar story was being the initiator and main author of the EBI white paper, biochar-based carbon sinks. For those of you who don't know it, I guess it's worth a read because many people joined that. Now, why did I take a deliberate decision to focus the rest of my professional life to biochar? And the answer to that question is in that slide. I mean, that has to happen. I mean, reducing the emissions and starting to build up negative emissions, this has to happen if this planet shouldn't be heated up like a sauna. And since I don't want to believe that this will happen, I believe that what we see here on this slide will happen. And that means that the area under the zero line is a huge business opportunity. And I mean really a huge business opportunity. If we multiply 10 gigatons with only $100, we talk about a $1,000 billion business. So there must be something. And that was the reason why I took that decision. Now, I'm going to take a quick benchmark to the solar industry, which is also a great industry. That's my second love, professional love. And we saw an unprecedented growth in the solar industry. And if you remember, I said that I founded the company, my solar company, in 2005. So solar was almost not existing as compared to today. Today, we have 700 gigawatt peak installed capacity. We had an average growth rate over 15 years with 36%, and Germany is really producing a significant part of the electricity in PV. And why I'm saying that? Because solar energy will become the most important energy source. And on the other side, I think biochar, at least for the next 15 to 20 years, will be the most important negative emission technology. So there's a lot of things in parallel. Now, since understanding market development is very important for investors, we also did, as EBI, the European Biochar Market Report, and we will do that once again this year. We'll do it actually every year. So we look, pyrolysis plant by pyrolysis plant above 200 tons. We collect them and we make statistics, and we saw that around the year 2016, 17, 18, it started that we have quite a significant number of pyrolysis plant installed. So what you see here is I mean, that's analyzed raw data, 72 plants that have been installed in Europe until the end of 2020. And we had total capacity by the end of 2020 of 20,000 tons. And we see that the market growth is growing, and that we expect the 2021 number to reach 35,000, maybe even 40,000 tons. So that number will come up early next year. Now, the interesting question is, I mean, a huge market doesn't guarantee a fast-growing business for all companies, obviously. So it is a good basis, but there needs to be more. What else is required to be investable for an investor? I mean, the first thing is you have to be unique. The second thing is team is, I mean, I actually should have put team at the first point. And when I say team, I really mean team. And a team is more than one person, ideally better more than two persons. I mean, key people. Then the third thing is investable companies really have to be credible and trustworthy. And next one is we need ambitious goals that should not be unrealistic. And last but not least, I always recommend my startups to really connect themselves with the other leading players in their ecosystem. A great example of where all these parameters are fulfilled is Carbon Future, where I invested and co-founded. So it is definitely unique because it's the only company, and they published that today, that are EBC Sync certified. It's an EBC Sync certified trader of carbon sinks, and the tracking is definitely unique and is very important. It's an incredible team. The company is trustworthy. I think it's the most credible trading platform for carbon sinks. The goals are ambitious, and last but not least, they're part of the European Biochar Industry Consortium, which is a great ecosystem to be there. So that was my quick introduction to my view on what companies should do to become investable.
That was great. Next up, we have Tom Kasten, who claims to be a retired CEO from the biomass industry, but I have never met a busier retired businessman in my life. So Tom has been an avid supporter of both the biochar industry and IBI, and is now helping to launch an ambitious startup in Washington State. So Tom, over to you. You have to unmute yourself, Tom, at the bottom. Still not there. Tom? Tom, can you unmute yourself?
All right, am I good? Thank you. Okay, start again. Thanks, Kathleen. And like Hans, I've decided to spend second half of my life on biochar, except I have more yesterdays than tomorrows, so I need help from the ecosystem. How do we attract investment to biochar? I'm going to look at what potential investors seek, what biochar offers those investors, and what could biochar offer. Next slide. The investor questions, and I'll go through these one at a time. Does the firm address an important issue? Carbon drawdown is an existential issue. We approach the biggest issue there is. Does the firm have traction to impact the issue? I think the combined global biochar industry production right now lacks traction on this issue. We need that 35% growth the solar industry has had. What is the quality and breadth of the management team? As you just heard, a lot of the production is mom and pop, two people, too small to staff all the positions. What is the quality of governance? There's not too many of the producers that have independent boards of directors and so forth. Can your product compete with alternatives? Small production that many people are practicing is inherently costly and misses some opportunities. How much time until the investor has a potential exit? It's going to take us years to scale, so we're going to need patient money. What is the likely exit multiple of the investment? That's hard to even guess until we improve the biochar proposition. Next slide, please. What is the perceived value proposition? The biochar customers believe that biochar is too expensive relative to its perceived benefits, and they seem to think the solution is increased government subsidies. Biochar producers think BC is too expensive to produce relative to benefits, and they seem to think the solution is government subsidies. I want to say that wishing for government subsidies is not a strategy and will not attract investors. We have to take the reins in our hand and improve the value proposition. Next slide. What could we offer to attract investors? What are we going to have to offer to grow this industry? We need to scale production up dramatically in order to reduce our cost per unit. I think we need to have a lot of small firms merge to obtain scale, regional presence, management depth, to build an ecosystem that's got more strength to it. I think we have a lot of opportunities to improve the biochar formulation so as to provide more benefits to farms and forests. Great opportunity. We all talk about getting two products, but the small producers very seldom make the electricity the way a big producer can. We've got to co-generate biochar and electricity, or maybe some other product, but we've got to improve revenues and cut our costs. My single most important message is the most optimistic. We should be able to capture a great deal more carbon drawdown credits per ton than we're getting. I'm going to spend a minute on the slide and ask the next slide, please. And I'm going to ask Kathleen to share this slide with everybody in the audience and ask you to look at the math and come back and challenge it. At the upper part of the slide, we're simply looking at what happens when a ton of biomass carbon turns into CO2, which is the best that ever happens. Any biomass we don't pick up turns into CO2 over 20 years. What happens if it turns into methane? That all gets to some points that you can deal with, but come down to that first heading, CO2 emissions from natural degradation. What I've graphed out here is that the carbon in the biomass would be 0 to 20% turning into methane, and therefore 100 to 80% turning into CO2. The next line, natural green global warming potential avoided, is really important. In the very best case, it all turns to carbon dioxide and we've avoided 9.1 tons. Because remember, we're burning 2.5 tons of carbon in order to make 1 ton of biochar. So if all of that 2.5 tons turn to carbon dioxide, it's 9.1. But look at where it's likely. Scientists have often found that about 20% of a pile of biomass turns into methane over time. Thinking 10 to 15%, you're looking at a potential to avoid 34 to 47 tons of CO2 just by pyrolyzing it instead of leaving nature to take it down. The bottom of the chart sums up where we are. We burn that much carbon to make biochar, and we're going to emit 4.6 tons of CO2. That's a negative. We're going to avoid whatever that number is, and I think that the right part of that range is in the 10 to 15%, 34 to 47 tons. Plus, we're going to get CO2 of avoided electric generation, which is, in the case of the big plant we're designing, 4.2 tons. There is then a defensible greenhouse global warming potential avoidance from soil organic carbon growth, from N2O avoidance, from reduced NPK. I can make a case from a lot of studies that that number looks more like 10 than 6. but I think we can defend 6. So you get to the bottom line, and look at this bottom line in comparison with the conversations all day yesterday about whether we're going to get between 2.5 and 3.2 tons of credit with all the certification agencies. We are leaving on the table 40 to 53 tons of CO2. Next slide, please. I think biochar is way underestimated. We can draw down a teraton of CO2e with existing waste biomass just from forest products alone. But this is going to need massive investment. I think the number is more like 2 trillion than 1 trillion. To attract this investment, we have got to improve the biochar value proposition. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I love that enthusiasm. I think this is why so many people are coming into the biochar space so quickly these days. Our next speaker is Andy Mercy, who is a serial entrepreneur out in California with a very unique backstory about how he was introduced to the biochar industry. He has jumped in feet first, not only as an investor, but as someone who's putting a significant amount of time and passion into helping to build up one of the biochar companies out in California. Andy, it's all yours.
Just 1 second, Andy, before we begin. Tom, can you please turn off your mic? There we go. Thanks. Sorry, Andy.
No problem. Thanks so much. It's great to be here. And hopefully that came up on the screen. I believe it did. So I'm taking a slightly different tact. Kathleen had sent out a few questions, and being the good student I am, I've tried to answer those questions pretty directly, but quickly by virtue of my background. I've been an entrepreneur for the last 20 years. I've always considered myself a social entrepreneur. My first company was called Angel Points, and we powered the philanthropy and sustainability programs of some of the largest companies in the world using a SaaS technology platform, web-based platform for the companies. Sold that in 2011, had a brief foray into local sustainable food, decided that wasn't really where my specific passion was, and really wanted to focus my tomorrows on climate change mitigation. Kathleen alluded to the story, which was that one of my neighbors happens to be Paul Hawken, and he was super generous to sit down with me for a few hours right before COVID and turned me on to biochar, introduced me to Kathleen and Albert Bates's book, Burn, which I'm sure many of you know. Went out and read it and became really passionate about biochar. Took me on about a year-long journey, interviewing people, oftentimes in sweatpants and a button-down shirt, the Zoom uniform, which I'm wearing now. And I arrived at the conclusion that biochar, for all the reasons Tom and Hans-Jorgen have already talked about, is such a wonderful opportunity. Interviewed dozens of entrepreneurs and was really fortunate to land on about an entrepreneur right in my backyard, and I'll talk about that in a second. So here we go. The first question that Kathleen asked, what advice might you give to a biochar company that's seeking investors? I like to think about one of the most classic business rules there is that Jim Collins has presented in his book, Good to Great, or Built to Last, and it quotes a very ancient parable, which is that the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And one of the things I think that a lot of entrepreneurs do is they try to tackle an issue like biochar from too many different sides. And as Kathleen pointed out in her really great blog post of a few years ago, the 5 stages of falling in love with biochar, the 5th stage is perhaps the most important, which is focus. The hedgehog knows how to do one thing. And I think that for a biochar entrepreneur to be successful, it's about figuring out what that one thing is that you can do better than anyone else, and that you can stay really true to during the course of your business evolution. So that's the question that was asked, and I hope I've answered it satisfactorily. In terms of my own investments in the space, I have invested in 2 companies, not to equal measures. So Pacific Biochar is a great example of a company that sort of lives and breathes the hedgehog principle. So Josiah Hunt, based right here in Sonoma County, California, has been living and breathing biochar for most of his adult life. From a farm in Hawaii to a enterprising company here in California, a public benefit corporation here in California. He's been motivated by the concept that he wants to leave a legacy of fertile soil. And by staying true to that very strong but simple proposition, it's forced him to think about how can he scale up biochar production as quickly as possible so that he can put carbon back in the soil and leave that legacy that he's been dreaming about. And he stumbled upon initially, but has really focused on a means of production that is working with cogeneration plants, similar to Tom's hypothesis, that can scale up biochar. And in 2022, based on the contracts that Pacific Biochar already has in place, the company will be producing somewhere in the order of 10 to 15,000 tons of biochar in 2022 alone, which according to Hans Jorgen would make it one of the largest, that would represent about 75% of the total market in Europe right now. So Pacific Biochar is onto something when it comes to scaling up biochar quickly. He's also been passionate about working with the farmers. That's taken a lot of time to get them to think about biochar as a long-term investment, and he's doing incredible work there. The other one, Willow, Chad Masura has an equal, I'd say, simple notion. That's a hedgehog notion, which is he's going to use his CPG experience and his e-commerce experience to get basically fertilizer products or retail lawn products out into the market as rapidly as possible, using all the tools that he's evolved over the years, moving products online. So he's going to do that one thing really well, move his lawn-based fertilizer products that are biochar-based through online commerce as rapidly as possible. He knows how to do that. He's incredibly focused, and if he's successful, companies like Pacific Biochar will have great vertical opportunities to sell their biochar into new channels like Willow. The next question was, what did you learn about the biochar industry after investing that you didn't realize before? And I'd say the number one thing there is that it's really hard to produce biochar at scale at a cost that makes sense right now. So fortunately, there are angel investors and venture investors who are willing to take a long-term horizon and invest in companies where the unit economics of a ton of biochar today might be $2,000 or more. But over time, through scale, that cost is going to come way down. A lot of companies, I think, who are willing to buy carbon credits are willing to pay right now in sort of the $75 to $100 price range per carbon credit. Based on the current methodologies out there today, that means that if you're producing biochar at roughly 200 to 250 a ton at the max, you can cover that cost of production with a carbon credit. Any higher than that, you're really going to be dipping into equity or other forms of capital. So producing large volumes of biochar at a price that's reasonable today is incredibly hard to do. And very few companies, from my experience, are doing that. So I think that's the thing I learned after I invested. That's so interesting to me. Number 3, what's the most challenging aspect of the biochar industry, and how do you see that being resolved? It really is about the industries that are going to be off-taking the biochar. In Pacific Biochar's case, the ag industry, for example, thinking about biochar not just as an operating input that needs to be covered in this year's budget, like a fertilizer, but more like a capital expense that can be paid for over 20 years based on the value gained. And in that way, too, I think it's similar to solar. The solar industry was very innovative about allowing consumers to sort of pay very little down or zero down, and then pay for the solar over a long time horizon based on the benefits that it provided. In a similar way, biochar provides benefits over a long term. So how do we create the financing mechanisms and the revenue models to allow those off-takers of biochar to pay for it over a long time horizon? I think that's one of the biggest challenges and also one of the biggest opportunities, which leads me to the last question, which is how can organizations like IBI and USBI help? And I think they're already doing it through symposia and conferences like this. But how do IBI and USBI get their tentacles out there into those industries that are going to represent the biggest off-takers? There's sort of two pieces to the biochar puzzle. One is investing in the technology. The other is investing in the total community that will benefit from biochar. And organizations like this can invest in that community, in education, in regulation, and in industry outreach to help all those other stakeholders really understand the value proposition of biochar so that we can all be more successful. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kathleen. Thank you so much. There's my email address if you want to reach me, and look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. I appreciate that you've answered all my questions. That's awesome. So next up is a slightly different perspective. If you were on with us yesterday, you would have heard from Teresa Lang from South Pole. But when I was speaking with somebody else from South Pole a week or so ago, I learned that they are entertaining new funding mechanisms. They're not out there yet, but they're non-equity plays, and they're very interested in supporting scaling of the biochar industry. So Teresa has agreed to talk to us a little bit about that, but keep in mind that this is yet to come, but it's probably around the corner because there's so much demand for biochar credit. So did I say that right, Teresa? I didn't want to box you in.
That works. Thank you. Let me share my slides. So I have a couple slides that are a repeat from yesterday, but for those who didn't join, just wanted to introduce South Pole background. My role is I'm the senior sourcing manager for North America at South Pole. So I work on biochar, but also a number of other project types. Admittedly, I am not the expert in investments at South Pole, but I am representing basically how we're approaching investments in this space for the company today. So quickly, just who South Pole is. South Pole is, we like to call ourselves a global sustainability services or solutions provider. But for your purposes today, you can think of us essentially as a carbon project developer. We are actually the largest carbon developer in this space, both in emission reduction, avoidance, and carbon removal projects globally. And we have about 15 years of expertise in this space, having won a number of awards and such as well. We have about 20 offices. The team has been growing really rapidly. We have over 600 people on staff now. See some of our offices and projects there. And then, like I said, we have worked in a number of different project types prior to beginning to work in biochar. So lots of forest conservation, methane capture, renewable energy, etc. So getting more to the biochar talk, you can really think of ourselves in the carbon space as an end-to-end solution provider. So we take these your project and your project concept that you're working on. We bring our technical support to really develop the carbon asset. Increasingly now we're also providing financial support as well. I'll get into that momentarily. And then we work with you to sell the carbon credits once they are generated to our network of buyers. We have over 1,000 active corporate clients, many large Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies. We have a sales force of over 50 sustainability professionals and really a top reputation in the market. Within biochar itself, We have been working on development of methodologies in this space, both being a key author in the Verified Carbon Standard VCS methodology, which if you tuned into the first session yesterday, you would have heard a little bit from VCS about that. And we are also a technical working group member on the Climate Action Reserves methodology. We have worked we have sold Puro credits and EBC credits as well, but from a project development perspective, we are really focused on VCS and CAR. And to date, because those protocols are still being finalized, there are no projects yet to speak of. So it's really early days for that industry. And the reason for that is we are, as a large carbon project developer, we are a part of this essentially trade group, ICROA, where we basically commit to certain standards within the space and have committed to doing projects within VCS CAR and a couple others. So quickly, I want to touch on investment opportunities as well as kind of what our business model has been up until this point. And then, of course, as Kathleen mentioned, we are starting to explore more financial investments in this space. So up until now, if we got on a call and we're talking about carbon project development, I would have said our standard business model is basically we're not making any financial investments, but rather we are doing the carbon asset project development at our own risk, so no cost to you. So going through the process of evaluating the project, what potential it has in terms of carbon removals, going through that certification with you, making sure you meet all of the eligibility requirements, doing the paperwork for that project development, and then selling the carbon credits at the end. So commercializing those credits, making a commission off of those credits when we sell them on your behalf to cover the costs that we incurred for project development. So up until now, that's been our primary business model. We do not do consulting work for the most part on project development. In the past we did, but we're moving away from that now. In some strategic circumstances, we can discuss it, but really we want to focus on getting carbon credits into our pipeline to sell to our end buyers. However, as Kathleen mentioned, that's beginning to change. We are starting to make financial investments off South Pole's own balance sheet. And we also have this next generation carbon removal purchase facility with that we are managing with Mitsubishi, which I'll speak to momentarily. Off our own balance sheet, we're looking at both upfront payment for streams of carbon credits. So where we basically pay you now for, say 100,000 tons of carbon removal credits per year for however many years. We are also exploring investments of capital to get a project off the ground where the payback would be in the form of those credits. We have actually begun to work on a couple of our initial biochar investments in H2 of 2021. Those still in the works, so I can't announce anything there yet, but we are looking at those potential investments are in Europe and Africa, and we're really hoping to make our first investments in the US and Canada in the coming year. But really, we are looking at biochar projects internationally, so please definitely talk to us. Regardless of where your project is located, we do have an ambition to begin investing and potentially invest many millions into biochar removal projects over the next year and coming years. So shifting gears slightly, the next gen carbon removal purchase facility with Mitsubishi is not just biochar, but it does have the potential to really leverage financing for biochar projects as well. We expect that this will unlock $300 million to $800 million of climate finance over the next 10 years. So I know some of you probably have your eyes popping out of your head. These are some really big projects. But like I said, it's not just biochar. We're looking at a range of carbon removal projects. And so it's basically a mixed portfolio. And biochar is, in the grand scheme of things, on some of the lower cost carbon credits within this portfolio. So direct air carbon capture and sequestration projects are in there as well. Carbon mineralization in construction materials, biomass energy carbon capture and sequestration, or known as BECCS, and enhanced weathering. So it is a portfolio approach there. We do have a number of anchor buyers. The idea here is to recognizing all of these are somewhat new technologies and carbon credit types that we're trying to aggregate demand as well as aggregate supply and try and move all of these project types along that innovation curve and bring the cost down. Here, we are focused on those long-term offtake agreements. However, there are some projects, some of those that I mentioned that we're exploring in Europe and Africa, we are exploring offtakes where it would be both in the purchase facility and potentially invested off South Pole's own balance sheet. So there's a combination approach there. So that is an option as well. As with the previous speakers, I wanted to touch on, so there's a little bit more information. Couldn't share more of the slides publicly. I didn't get approval in time, so sorry about that. I just joined this panel this week. But I did want to speak briefly at the main stages of biochar projects and what we need to really be able to consider a project for investment. So, you know, we kind of look at biochar projects from the carbon perspective as having at least these 3 stages. The sourcing of biomass, it has to be under all of the protocols we are looking at, it has to be waste biomass. If you are growing biomass for the express purpose of making it biochar, that will not be eligible. So I have another slide showing you a list of some of those eligible biomass, waste biomass sources. The biochar production, I won't get into all of the requirements there, but definitely, as the previous speakers were saying, we do have to look at what is the energy consumption for the production of biochar, as well as what is the transportation of the waste biomass to the biomass production facility. If it's under, I believe 200 kilometers, then you don't have to account for it. But if you're going like halfway across the world, you do have to account for those emissions. And then finally, how is the biochar being applied or utilized? Because this is where the actual climate benefits are generated. So that needs to be a part of the project as well. So when you come to us with a potential investment, we do need you to have had some thinking on what all of these different steps look like for your project. If you haven't figured out one or the other, it's too early stage for us, but we can still provide you some information of what we're looking for in the future. So just quickly touching on some of those eligible feedstocks. So agricultural waste biomass, food processing residues, forestry and other wood processing, recycling, aquaculture, animal manure, high carbon fly ash. So for the purposes of project accounting, you cannot mix the feedstocks, but there may be an opportunity if you're keeping the feedstock separate and have different biochar produced from different feedstocks. Those might be able to be aggregated within one project as long as the feedstocks themselves are not mixed within the biochar production. And finally, who participates in the projects? So this is also a key part. So we need both the biochar producer, which I think is the vast majority of folks at this conference. The biochar producer is typically the one we end up working with on developing a project. It's really important that we understand, you know, essentially what are those feedstocks, what is going into the process, you know, looking at all of these different emission sources as we do the quantification. South Pole, of course, has a role both developing the project, the carbon asset, if you will, certifying the project, potentially providing that investment, commercializing the credits. Sometimes there are other industry partners as well. That's not necessarily always the case, and it's not a critical piece. But then, of course, we do have the end user or farmer. Even though the biochar producer is typically the one we engage with for these projects, really the end user is probably the most important actor here because they're the ones ensuring the permanent carbon removal by using that biochar. So they need to participate in the project in some way, both monitoring their ongoing use of biochar. They do have to kind of attest to this ongoing kind of how the biochar is you know, you apply the biochar, for example, to a field. I'll actually go to the next slide. You know, a farmer would buy the biochar, sorry, there's an error on this slide. Buy the biochar, apply it to his field, and then the farmer would be the initial owner of those carbon credits. So basically, they would need to engage with the biochar producer to essentially kind of contract over the rights to the emission reductions, or in this case, the carbon removals, as well as commit to this ongoing permanence and monitoring. So we have some thoughts and we have some draft contracts in kind of facilitating that kind of contracting of the emission reductions, but it is a key piece. So if you're just a producer and you don't yet have a line of sight to how all your biochar is being used, again, you're too early for us, but we can definitely talk a little bit more about how this could work in the future. So that's it. Please take note of my email address. Would be happy to chat with some of you more. Admittedly, not too much time to chat before the holidays, but happy to get something on the calendar for the new year and also send you some additional materials. So thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. And I'll invite the other panelists to come back up on stage, if you will. Before we go to quick Q&As, the one thing I forgot to mention early this morning was that Tom, Miles, and I will be doing the wrap up at 2 o'clock, and we will be taking some of your questions. So if you want to put some of those questions in the Q&A for us to consider before then, please feel free to do that. We only have about 14 minutes and we have over a dozen questions. So I would just like to ask at least one of the ones to the other panelists that Andy asked, and that is, what did you learn about the biochar industry after investing that you didn't really understand before? I really liked Andy's answer and would like to see Tom and Hans-Jörg if you have anything to add to that.
Well, very quick answer. It is really convincing the end user to use the biochar. That is, these are typically conservative people, and be it farmers, but also what we see in Sweden, the great work that has been done by Ecotopic and Bloomberg Foundation in Stockholm. It actually takes too long of a time to convince end customers to use biochar. We're getting traction now, and that is the recent change we see in the industry, but it took longer than I thought. It always takes longer, and we thought that this is where we really need to work as an ecosystem together to share our end user capabilities to convince customers.
Totally agree.
Kathleen, my comment is it's just staggering how complex this whole process is to get to the value. And what I've learned is going from seeing biochar as the best actor to realizing that biochar is not the best actor. It's the best supporting actress. It enables the things that act. Secondly, very few of the world understand or accept that survival of the fittest organism was a mistake. That in fact, it's survival of the fittest ecosystem, and that we have this massive microbiome that's what's making it all tick. And whether it's in the forest industry, poisoning trees, or farmers plowing the ground too deep, we're killing the ecosystem. I come to the scale question because to make this really work, you need a lot of different talents, people that have spent most of their life learning one small piece to get it right. And I'm not sure you can just concentrate on one place without knowing everything from how you get permits to how you do cogeneration to how you make a better product to how you market it to how you deal with the government. This is complex business.
Yeah. And add on top of that the carbon markets, which is new, exciting, but a little overwhelming at times. Okay. So the question that has been asked every single day, and it always gets upvoted, but it's not necessarily particularly relevant to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is what price range is biochar selling for? And what are the ranges by region and use case? So if we could be really quick on that, because my answer is it's very variable, but you guys may want to answer more precisely. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, let me go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be quick. We look at historical data, which is more in the $400 to $500 a ton range, and we look at our pro forma data, which has to do with market research, and with our ag buyers, and included in that is a very large institutional owner of permanent crops, one of the largest ag owners in the world. They seem to be very interested in moving a lot of biochar in the $150 a ton range. So that's what we know. And I do think that this will evolve over time continually, and there will be financing instruments that could change this equation as well. So that's what I've got for you right now.
Thanks, Andy. Hans-Jörg?
Well, totally different perspective from Europe, with much higher prices here in Europe. And actually, I think the right number, and it's always good to give easy numbers. I think the right price for large scale offtake, I mean truckload wise, is 500 euros per ton, or dollars per ton. And the reason is because then you can cover roughly 50% of that cost with a carbon sequestration value. And then there remains, we need to incentivize that people we need to make sure that people are incentivized to be smart, to find applications where the value of the material itself pays off. Because if we don't do that, there's a huge risk that people are buying biochar for 150 euros and then they burn it. And then if you don't have very good tracking systems and I mean carbon sequestration platform tracking systems, then we will see carbon sinks that are no carbon sinks. So I think 500 euros is the right price for large scale offtake.
Okay. Tom, do you have a perspective yet on that? Or?
I do. I think, first of all, it's very important to separate wholesale and retail. And, you know, some people that are rather inefficient producers are finding a way to make a living by putting it in bags and selling it. And you can sell a bag of 20 pounds of stuff for $20 in the big retail box stores. That's $1,000 a ton. But are you selling it direct? So I think that's one thing. I can tell you that in the projections that we're doing in a plant that would make 40,000 tons a year, is we think with the current credits, we can get down to $200 at a wholesale level before it gets marked up.
Okay, we have so many more questions. I'm going to try to be really quick and maybe not have all of you, but those of you that have a strong opinion. And Teresa, I'm skipping you because I'm not sure that's part of your perspective yet. But what kind of ROI are those interested investors looking for in dollars or in offsets or things like that? And how can ordinary people invest? Anyone want to take a shot? I think in the chat there was actually a really nice answer to how can ordinary people invest, and it's at this stage either through the carbon credit market or through supporting the purchase of biochar, or even helping to educate those about biochar. That would be really supportive of an industry.
My experience has been that equity investors in very firm things are looking for 12 to 15%. Angel investors are looking for much higher because they know some of what they're doing is going to fail. And it's very hard to attract angel investors without an expectation that they're going to get 5 times their money back.
Yeah, that's what I would have said. Three times at least, because I mean, if you do 5 angel investments, you will likely lose 1 or 2 or even more. I'm lucky, but only because I'm very actively managing the startups.
And I would just add, on the qualitative side, you know, I agree with everything that was just said, and then qualitatively, making sure that you have aligned investors, because, you know, I think we are at a stage where there is a lot of money coming into this industry that understands that it's at the pioneering end of things, you know, as Hans-Jörg said, maybe earlier than where solar was in 2000. And so having investors that are excited by the mitigation potential and see that there will be financial returns, maybe in a 7-year horizon, could be beneficial. And I think there are a lot of those types of investors out there right now.
And I can fully support that. It's really changing. I mean, when I started to invest 2017 in Carbona, and then I discussed with other investors, and then I said, bio what? and it has absolutely changed, and we have a different situation right now.
You know,
I
and
support that. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. There's so little time.
Yeah. So Teresa, I want to ask you one of the questions. Someone was asking, you said that the farmer needs to be an active partner. How do you all propose a producer find these end users to offload the biochar? Or is there a resource to help find offtake agreements?
That's a really great question. It's something we're exploring more and more because we've realized a lot of the biochar producers that have approached us are surprised to realize they need to know who's using the biochar and kind of track that. I did see a question in general chat also asking about the monitoring piece. And I will say, it's not that you're monitoring every single day or something like that. You basically need to do a check of how the biochar was applied to the soil, and that, you know, the land hasn't suddenly become, you know, if you thought it was ag, that suddenly it's been developed and there's apartments there now, right? So something much more simple than that. We are trying to do some of that matchmaking potentially in the future, but it's not something we fully worked through yet. Right now, we've been focusing on if you have in mind, you know, maybe you have some large wholesale buyers, those could potentially be the folks we need to engage with. And we do have some contracts where the carbon rights are being transferred to the producer to enable these projects. But we're still figuring out that piece of kind of doing that matchmaking. And it may be something we're able to offer in the future, but right now we're not quite there yet.
Right. So I'm not sure if this group has input on this yet, but there's a question about whether anyone is using pyrolysis to create hydrogen and biochar. And I know in Europe you have some that are looking at it, but I don't know if you guys have experience with that yet.
I can just say that one of the companies that we are exploring partnerships with on the pyrolysis side in Canada is CharTech. And CharTech is looking at creating a byproduct of both renewable natural gas and green hydrogen as a byproduct of the pyrolysis process. I don't know how evolved it is yet. I think it's early days, but they definitely are doing some interesting work there.
Yeah. Well, I would say for those that can, there's an event next month in Nantes, France, which is called Bio360, and they will have several biochar producers and technology folks there. And last year when I went before COVID, there was a biochar company that was focusing on hydrogen production. I just can't remember the name. So Tom, did you want to have a quick word?
Quick comment on hydrogen. You have to have a way to get it to the market. In some cases, you're next to a natural gas pipeline and you've got a way to do it. But almost everybody is going to have access to an electric transmission wire. Very few people are going to be able to move hydrogen. It's a whole other bit of infrastructure.
Yeah, that's the same thing with the biogas industry, right?
Yes.
Also, I'm not sure if this is the right forum for it, but I'm going to ask, what will induce investments in the developing world in the biochar space? South Pole might have more of a bent on that. Teresa?
Well, I mean, I think from the carbon credits perspective, it can be a vehicle to bringing more investment, right? But as I said before, we do need both the producer and the end user to be a part of that process. So, you know, once we maybe get more involved in this matchmaking, if that does happen, or if we find a producer who has some really good application already underway and is looking to expand in international markets, that's definitely something we might be able to support in the future. We are absolutely looking at some biochar projects in Africa right now, for example. So I'm not personally familiar with that. I focus on the North American market, but South Pole is a really, you know, a big international footprint. Candidly, we're called South Pole in large part because we focused on the global South for much of our history. So, you know, if you are working in both Europe or the US and want to expand into the global South, that's definitely something we'd love to talk more about.
Quick comment on that. Our foundation invests in 1 acre fund that now serves 1.5 million people in 8 African countries. The very simple answer is those farmers have no money. The biochar has to pay for itself in the first year. And if it doesn't pay for itself, one of their kids may starve. So it has to be a really good proposition. Against that, in some of those soils, it does pay for itself in less than a year. And the NGOs can provide the upfront for 2 or 3 years and make it work, but they don't have the cash to invest.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sorry we won't get to the rest of the questions. Maybe some of you guys could answer them in the chat. I know that's not usually our format, but at least we could get some answers out there. In the meantime, I want to thank you all for sharing your wisdom and experience here. And I think we're going to have another 15 to almost 20-minute networking break. So if you guys have time, grab a table on the first floor or so that people can come ask you a few more questions. And with that, I'll leave it to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Kathleen, and thank you to all of our panelists. So yeah, we're going to go back to our networking mode now for the next 20 minutes. We'll be back at 12:50 Eastern. Please find our panelists if they can stay on the floor. Please also check out our sponsor tables on the first floor. That's where you'll find the representatives. We'll see you all back at 12:50.
Thank you.